from Picasso, where Cubism disposal was still focused on the center part of the canvas with a real emphasis on a centripetal construction mode, American painting from the 40s would show a re-engagement of the size and the shape of the frame. In 1947, the so-called School of New York gave their blessings to the creation of an intellectual foyer in art school, Subjects of the Artist, whose main purpose was to surpass analytic and synthetic Cubism automatism. In Art and Objected, Fried reminds us about 4 points he sees as essential in catching a glimpse of the evolution of painting in America from Pollock to Stella. But before developing 3 points, I would like to detail a bit more the term of illusion that is defined by Greenberg as an optic illusion and not a sculptural illusion like trompe-l'œil. I quote, "The first mark made on a canvas destroys its literal and utter flatness, and the result of the marks made on it by an artist like Mondrian is still a kind of illusion that suggests a kind of third dimension. Only now is it strictly pictorial, strictly optical, third dimension." The quotation from modernist painting is used by Fried to explain his first point relating to the emerging illusionism in American painting. In L'Atelier de Pollock, Rosalind Krauss develops this idea of illusionism using the same quotation as Fried. I quote, "The formal terms proposed by Greenberg tended to distinguish a peculiar painterly space within Pollock's practice, a space that would respond to the condition from the so-called modernist painting. For Greenberg, the distribution of soaked and almost gnarly lines on vast canvas surfaces establish a specific synthesis between the physical planarity of the tableau surface as an object and painting spatial illusionism as phenomenological data. This illusionism can be identified in the treatment of the surface, a treatment defined by Rosenberg within the concept of all over. Opposing the centripetal construction at work in Cubism, Jean Clay would also refer to painterly illusionism in his article Pollock-Mondrian Seurat, The Flat Depth. I quote, "This flat depth, or spatium, is exclusively determined by plastic constituents, linear or chromatic." End of quotation. In Pollock's case, gesture and rhythms are associated within the plastic constituents of the disposal, but the very size of the frame is not printed on the dynamic of the work as we often imagine it. Clay reminds us that the designation of all over is not accurate in defining Pollock's procedure. It is a, I quote, "determination to cover everything or it is not a determination to cover everything or a compulsive maculating process. It is rather a concerted take-back, a work in 2 times. It even happened that the artist exposed his work the way he painted them to reduce them afterwards in the studio to the size we know. This intervention's second moment is decisive because it leads to a precise layout of the margin or even to a cut into painting's thickness. We can see why the notion of all over doesn't apply for Pollock as we usually think. The definition of all over given by Rubin can't be applied to Pollock's unless it takes account of the framing. Krauss' article about Pollock will also contradict Rubin's approach of the all over technique. I quote, "The tangles are painted towards the frame of the canvas, but often stop before. The painting incorporates its own frame by means of untouched cloth that borders the all-over image." In one of Pollock's late works, the need for depth becomes explicit within the title of the painting. It's a singular painting within Pollock's production. In 51, Pollock's dripping had given all they possibly could give. He then reintroduced human figure, partially under the influence of Matisse jazz and the myths he already developed after the Second World War. Simultaneously to figuration, the problem around background and surface, partially eluded within his larger works, started to present themselves again. In 53, The Deep, one of Pollock's last painting, we can clearly see it emphasizes the notion of illusionism developed by Greenberg and Fried. It also underlines more pragmatically the need for Pollock to achieve once more the opening he had achieved within drippings. A nebulous, creamy effect surrounds the abyssal opening from which a few colored drips are escaping towards their white velvety surroundings. The notion of depth in this particular painting seems to be the link between painterly abstraction, as defined by Greenberg, and color field painting, also defined by the formalist art critic. Somehow, it is the link between strictly pictorial means and haptic spaces. The second of Fried's point, or the neutralization of the planarity of the painterly support by painterly illusionism, is defined by Fried as follows. In Pollock's and Newman's painting, but even more in the ones produced by Lewis, Noland and Olitsky, the new illusionism subsumes and dissolves the surface of the tableau, opening it from the back, while still preserving its integrity. Three important notions are present in this quote. Firstly, the notion of painterly illusionism is not limited to painterly abstraction, but also addresses color film paintings, two generations of artists. It supposes a theoretical continuity under a formal discontinuity. Secondly, the notion of opening of the surface, or the dissolution from the surface by painted marks. Fried tells us the term of opening was used by Greenberg to replace the notion of optical in the mid-60s, after the essay After Abstract Expressionism. Thirdly, the notion of integrity of the surface of the tableau, a notion that will be formally criticized and overruled by French painting from the end of the 60s and the 70s, Antaille, Rouen, and especially Christian Bonnefoy. The third of Fried's point concludes on the discovery after 1960 of a new time of painterly structure founded on shapes rather than on the planarity of the support. We can see this point embodied in the shapes of the frames used by Stella, Newman or Noland. The immanence of the shape is in fact the immanence of the literal shape of the frame over the planarity of the support. The literal form determines the complete structure of the tableau. The painted surface and the literal frame are unified in a field of symmetrical forces, as we see here with Stella at work. Before going any further, I would like to The 4th point insists on the immanence of the literal form over the painted form with certain nuance in Noland's case. If the optical turn of formalist painting could be seen as the apogee of the surface, subsumed to the size and the shape of the frame, European painting from the late 60s and the 70s re-engaged the very thickness of painting, or as in the case of BMPT, the meaning of the gesture within a very strict and minimal procedure. We can see it here with Daniel Buren. But it would take too long to depict all the variety of practices at work here. I have for my part chosen to describe the concept of thickness adapted to painting within the painted and theoretical world of Christian Bonnefoy, work from which this concept emerges. In 1973, he produced his first collages. He glues different papers to each other, then he rips them off, leaving but a thin perimeter glued to the surface. He then realized he had produced a conglomeration of layers, an accumulation only revealed when the upper layer was peeled off. For Tristan Trémaud, I quote, this operation seemed necessary to him at the very beginning of his experiences. The paper subjectile is in this case the place of an experiment whose result can be dissociated from the nature of the support on which it took place. This very same experience will be used as a model by Bonnefoy for other works with other materials. We have to see it as a matrix, but whose structure tolerates displacement and certain dynamics. Bonnefoy's practice is often related to the destruction of the surface, both painted surface and surface to be covered. But it's not only a physical destruction of the surface integrity, it is a highly theoretical deconstruction from the very concept of surface that emerges from American formalism. He declares, I quote, the surface is the product of the support and the materials that are glued to it. The surface is embodied in the resulting thickness. When we reduce one of these terms, the planarity of the support or the planarity of the materials fixed to it, we miss the production of the surface. The surface is clearly a product of two dynamics. It is not a given fact. It has to be produced. If I insist on the concept of thickness as a determination of surface and an invisible place where the pictorial materials are transformed, it is because I try to do without rhetoric rules, but also to use a term that has no chance whatsoever to manifest by his own effect, in opposition to the modernist tautology axed on the surface and for corollary, the identification of the real and painted limits. When pointing towards thickness, Bonnefoy is in fact pointing towards intermediary spaces, entrelacs. The phenomenological concept of entrelacs is taken from the visible and invisible from Merleau-Ponty. It points towards an interstice painting should invest, an interstice he identifies within Cubist collage, I quote. The sense of Cubist collage lies in the interstice, in the non-disjunctive spacing between what comes from elsewhere, from the future, that which cannot be figured, and what comes upwards, from underneath, from the ground. The interval is the site of expectation of the event and of enigma. To fully understand this investment, we also have to understand that it corresponds with the theoretical rediscovery of the subjectile with Jean Clé's essay La peinture en charpie in the journal Macula, a journal to which Bonnefoy repeatedly contributed. In the very same edition, he writes an article entitled About the Destruction of the Surface Entity, in which he clearly charges minimal painting. I quote, that painting should paradoxically have nothing or little to show in what it covers or reveals does not mean that it must create a rhetoric of nothing to show or barely perceptible. But the idea of thickness is not only a vague concept whose meaning is only to contradict American formalism and minimal painting. It is a way for Bonnefoy to nourish his own practice, insisting on the very idea of disposal. By defining the tableau as a disposal, he also draws a line between Brunelleschi's optical machineries from the Florentine Renaissance, Cubist collages, and Matisse gouache cutouts. This implies certain continuities throughout the epistemological rupture of art history, but it also implies an ontological interpretation of the tableau. Bonnefoy defines his modes of being, defines the modes of being of his disposal, his ways of expanding throughout the frame, throughout the substrate itself. The tableau occurs somewhere between the layers. It is shown through the surface from the depth of the canvas, to quote Laura Lisbon, from his ground. The journey we have accomplished shows the multiple and dense interpretation the notion of space endured during the last century. Within the focus of surface and thickness, we have witnessed the uprising of the grounds of painting. Fauvism and Cubism overthrow the notion of artisanal achievement, like a question posed to painting itself. The untouched cloth in Matisse's landscape and the geometrical depth in Picasso's brothel signify they had taken painting where Cézanne had left it. Somehow, formalism pushed the very concept of surface to its paradox within its apogee during the 60s. American painting became auto-referenced and showed a clear rupture with European sources. Cubism had played a major role in the early developments of painterly abstraction, but the very notion of presence was displaced from the object to the tableau itself. Within this focus, we can clearly see the rise of phenomenology within American painting. We could, for example, quote Maurice Reading from Husserl's Phenomenology, or the propagation of Gestalt theory as a psychology of the shape. This clearly pushed towards the immanence of the shape as Fried described it. The lack of plastic events started to withdraw painting itself from any depth or even from any visibility. The concept of thickness forces us to look beyond the surface as obvious data, to carry further the question of space within painting. I thank you.